Hello everybody, my name is Harry Wolf and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be continuing on our multi-part journey into the land of CSS and web applications. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, please do check out my previous video about it. The link's going to be in the show notes, but suffice it to say, we're kind of delving into the world of how CSS can scale for large web applications, not just websites. Today's episode, we're going to be focusing on this fun, newish technology called CSS Modules. CSS Modules came out around, I want to say, 5 years ago, around 2015, and it was a pretty amazing innovation in the land of CSS technologies. Before CSS Modules, there were just plain CSS processors. There was less, Sass, and then there's conventions about how to write CSS at scale. The big thing with CSS modules is that it kind of took the human element of BEM, SMAX, all these large scale frameworks for writing CSS that can scale to large applications. It took those best practices of having these namespace way of writing CSS class names and built it into a machine to do it for you, such that when you write CSS with CSS modules, you're actually namespacing every CSS class name that you're writing. So to give you a little bit more concrete details about what that looks like, let's start looking at my screen because that always helps to explain things. So this is the home page for CSS modules. And what's funny about CSS modules is that it was first written as an idea and not necessarily an implementation, which most technologies on the web, you kind of have the idea, make the implementation, and then release it onto the world. CSS modules just came out into the world as an idea. So I'm not going to go into the details of this page. You can look at it yourself. I'm going to kind of show you in real life examples what it means, but there's only 2 implementations that I'm aware of on this page, at least, of CSS modules in action. One is with Webpack, and one is with Post CSS modules. The weird thing about CSS modules is that it lives in this land between regular CSS and CSS and JS. And it kind of builds into the bundler that you might use for your web application. So in this example, it's going to be Webpack, which is where the implementation of CSS modules is actually created. Which is an interesting way of, you want to have your CSS scale to your web application at large, so it makes sense to kind of plug it into the bundler itself. So let's use a live example to kind of walk you through what CSS modules actually is. Here's an example of a small little page that I've made with React. CSS modules isn't tied to React, but it definitely is used a lot with React applications, so I'm going to be showing that in this context here. This is a very plain non-CSS modules example right now where we have some regular HTML with plain vanilla CSS class names that are being defined in here, and everything is working as expected. If I were to change this color to be red, it would refresh and be red. So this is not using CSS modules, as we can see. But to enable CSS modules, this is built on top of a ejected create React app application, which I ejected from just to kind of show you what's involved with enabling CSS modules. I'm using, this is the large Webpack configuration that's using the CSS loader from the Webpack ecosystem, where it's testing for .css files. And there's just one argument here that says modules false. If I turn this to modules true and restart the bundler, keep your eye on the UI on the left. The blue CSS modules with the underline, the bold. When I restart this and it kicks back up, it's going to now, so you see that everything just changed. This is because now when Webpack is importing this .css file, it's actually applying the rules of CSS modules to this CSS file. So what does that mean? It means that by default, all of these class names have become namespace to its own particular use. To access that, I'm actually going to import styles from .css. And this is where the real magic and power of CSS modules is shown. I'm actually importing this object from the .css file. And this styles object, if I were to log it out, looks like this. So you can see here, if I look at the CSS file, I have here container, description, and title. Things that also appear on my CSS file. And what CSS Modules does is it actually automatically makes unique class names for all of my local class names in here. So I could have 10,000 .css files that all have a .container class name inside of them. If I'm using CSS Modules, when it's imported and transformed by Webpack, it'll actually be given this own unique class name, which means that I can then take this styles and then use that variable styles.container and save that to see those class names applied. Same thing with title, styles.title. So I'm now able to encapsulate the behavior and have it not leak out anywhere else. Let's also do description. Here we go. So that is what helps make CSS scale across a large application, where you can have as many styles as you want inside of here and then not worry about these styles being overridden by another .container class in another file at all. It makes it more deterministic where these styles are coming from, because there's a direct coupling from the .css file to the actual definition of there. But one of the things that, and then also there's other features of CSS modules, just so I don't forget all of them. There is the ability to switch into global. If you need to actually have some things actually be global, you can actually have, for example, let's say I want to have the H1. I want to have an H1 be red. I can actually go here and say color red. It did not work. Let's do, because of specificity, let's do border 1px solid red. There we go. So this is now a globally applied style that any H1 will have applied to itself. So if I look in here, H1 right there, border 1 red. What other features do we have here? Composition is another interesting feature of CSS modules, where you can actually kind of in CSS compose class names together. Not going to go into that too much in depth. But so CSS modules has a lot of power and has a lot of flexibility. However, there's two gotchas about it that make it not my preferred CSS solution. And gotchas or trade-offs depending upon your way of looking at it. The first one is, I'm not sure if you noticed, but these three items here actually never had their styles changed when we enabled CSS modules. All of them are still italic. And we look at the selector here. The reason for that is because CSS modules transforms class names, but it can't transform element selectors. Such being, if you accidentally include an element selector in your .css file, it is now globally present in every part of your application. So if I actually inspect this, I can see UL font style italic. Of course, the fix is to say, to have there be a class name here to be list. And then now that should change here. And if I change this to be class name, or class name styles list, it works then, because if I look into that styles object, I don't know why I deleted that. It's always helpful to inspect what's going on here. Well, it's a class name, but the class name is targeting all the LIs inside of it. So right here, you can see that's the style that's actually created. So that's one big gotcha, in my opinion, where you can accidentally leak global stylings, and if you aren't worried about it, it's just there. Another thing that's not lovely for me is that it still has this boundary between CSS and JavaScript. So if you have some variables like layout spacing or colors that you want to have both available in CSS and in JavaScript, there is no real way to do that with CSS modules. There's workarounds. I've seen some people do stuff with JSON where you can kind of import it back and forth, but they're workarounds because if I have a variable here, there's no way for me to actually expose it in the .js file and vice versa. So there's still very much a strict divider between those two worlds, which is also a strength because you can just keep thinking about CSS as you normally do and then have all those BEM conventions be applied for you for free by having things be nicely encapsulated here. That's the overview of CSS modules. It was huge when it came out. I used it extensively for a large application at a previous job. It helped so much scale the application to become maintainable and easy to be developed on across a huge team of people working on the code base. It definitely has those trade-offs, which I got frustrated with a lot. I think that project itself, I was also trying to do post CSS instead of less, and I think I like less a lot more than post CSS, which is a whole nother argument that I'm not going to get into right now. But if you are interested about doing CSS more at scale, CSS modules is an excellent addition to your toolbox to be able to have things be easy to maintain, to know where things are coming from. So definitely encourage you to at least try it out, make your own opinions about whether it's good for you before you kind of discard it or not. But that's CSS modules. They just let you easily namespace CSS class names. A very simple idea, but as I like to say, CSS modules takes the C out of the CSS because it doesn't cascade anymore. Hopefully you enjoyed that video. Stay tuned for the last wrap up of this little journey about CSS and applications. Hopefully we'll talk about CSS and JS then. If you're not already a subscriber, please become a subscriber down below. Become a Patreon subscriber as well if you'd like. And I hope to see you again in the next video when it is out. Until then, bye.